Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. This is an issue of enormous consequence, I believe, to our global competitiveness, our economy, and the country that embraces and gets ahead and wins the race on 5G, I think, is going to benefit enormously in terms of the economic dividends that will come with that. Mr. Gillen, a number of cities and states across the country are modernizing their siting policies in order to reap the benefits of 5G, and much of the early investment in 5G is going to places that have acted first. That's why I'm pleased that in my home state of South Dakota, the city of Sioux Falls, among others, has adopted a forward-looking approach to the opportunities that next-generation wireless services will bring. I'm also pleased that the FCC has updated its guidance to states and localities to reflect new wireless infrastructure such as small cells. All of this is consistent with the Streamline Small Cell Deployment Act, bipartisan legislation that Senator Schatz and I introduced last Congress. Let me just ask this question. How important is streamlining the siting process to deployment of 5G?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your focus, and you've really driven this issue to get 21 states to act, to get cities like Sioux Falls to engage on this. You've brought the leadership to make this happen, and it is critical. We are not going to get where we want on 5G if we continue to have rules that look like everything's a 200-foot tower along the sideways, along the highway. And so fundamentally is how do we modernize these rules for tomorrow's networks? And with your leadership, we've made great progress over the last 2 years.
Thank you. And you're losing your voice, so I'm sorry to make you answer these questions. But I've got one other one, and that has, as you know, there's a robust wireless network with the speed and capacity to handle thousands and eventually millions of autonomous vehicles is crucial to realizing what I think are going to be enormous safety benefits that a connected transportation system would offer. And during this Congress, I expect to continue to work on defining a federal framework for this emerging technology. Could you speak to the ways in which the deployment of 5G will benefit the emergence of autonomous vehicles?
Absolutely, and the importance of the ability to test here. If we want innovation to happen here, if we want this leadership for the industries of tomorrow to happen in the United States, we have to be an incubator for it. We have to allow the testing of it. We have to allow that to be developed. And so your legislation is critical when we start talking about the life-saving aspects that my colleague has talked so eloquently about this morning, that to get to those things, we need to test these technologies. We need to understand what they are, and that we need your legislation.
Okay. Mr. Berry, last October, U.S. Cellular, a member of both CCA and CTIA, expressed support for the rural dividend included in Senator Gardner's Airwaves Act, which would allocate 10% of auction proceeds to wireless deployment in unserved and underserved areas. Given that the FCC is moving ahead with auctions of much-needed new spectrum licenses regardless of legislation, what are your thoughts about immediately creating a rural dividend mechanism to capture the benefit from auctions for targeted rural build-out support?
Senator, thank you. We're totally in favor of that concept. We supported it last year. I would note that we did a study at CCA, the assessment of the economic impact of the Airways Act itself, and we just looked at the expected revenue from two auctions, 24 and 28. What would be the economic impact to rural America should that rural dividend be in place? $1.25 billion economic impact to agriculture, $3.35 billion to health care, and $850 million impact to transportation. And that's just from one suggested, auction of the, it's actually two auctions, 101, 102. But that was a good example to use. And by the way, the study came pretty close to what was actually the number auctioned in the recent 101 auction. So I think those numbers are really lowball numbers. If we're talking about 3 or 4 or 5 different types of auctions, we're talking about a huge opportunity for rural America. I totally support. Yes, sir.
Good. One last quick question. Mr. Gillum, you've testified before this committee that mid-range spectrum leverages both capacity and coverage opportunities, which is helpful in more rural settings. Tell us why this band is so important to America's 5G leadership and what we can do to ensure that the wireless industry has enough mid-band spectrum to deploy 5G.
Thank you, Senator. The value of mid-band is that it provides both capacity and coverage. That right now we have high-band spectrum that is incredibly valuable, but it only can go a couple blocks. We have low-band spectrum that can go miles, but doesn't carry the amount of bandwidth that we're going to need for a lot of 5G applications. We think in a lot of places, mid-band will be what we'll be using for 5G. It's also, frankly, something that we just don't have that much of right now available in the market, only 70 megahertz that will be auctioned hopefully this time by next year. So for us, it really is how do we get our national resources focused on making sure we have all type of spectrum for all different types of applications and communities.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. Thank you all very much.